steps. Grace and Samuel walked out side by side, their hands brushing before they clasped together.